Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Today we are taking a look at the absurd through Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. So Camus himself was a 20th century French, Algerian-born author, journalist, philosopher, wrote a number of works. So he wrote a number of plays and books. He's involved in the theater. So there could be a whole sort of interesting course on Camus' writings and really just philosophy and literature and things like that. He won a Nobel Prize in 1957, died in a car accident in 1960. He was associated with existentialism, a 20th century sort of German, French philosophical movement. In particular, it was popular in France in the post-World War II years. Camus himself had a friendship with Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the most famous existentialists. Camus himself didn't like that term. He rejected that term. In fact, a lot of the existentialists did. But arguably, Camus, rather than being an existentialist, was an absurdist. There's a little bit of a difference, so we're going to see him talking about the absurd here today. So I think I'll just stop my remarks on that right now, just on the absurd part. But existentialism, in very short version of it, is really the view that the world is sort of meaningless, senseless. It itself doesn't come with values or anything like that. Humans are born into this world without purpose, without meaning, value, but instead we can create those things. We imbue the world with value. So here you can think a lot about Klemke and what I was talking about yesterday, who holds a very similar sort of view to the existentialists, at least to that extent. Okay, so in this piece, the Myth of Sisyphus, we're going to see Camus really do a few things. So right at the start of the course, we already really talked about this first point, that the meaning of life is one of the most urgent questions. This is the way Camus characterizes it, so we're going to hear a little bit more about that. He also thinks about, really the whole point of the piece is really exploring the relationship between the absurd and feelings of absurdity and suicide, and ultimately Camus is going to conclude that even though life is meaningless, that does not entail that we should commit suicide. Rather, instead, the appropriate response is really revolt, which is really, in short form, to go on living despite the fact that there's no good reason to. But we'll see. And one note I'll make about the text in general is that Camus' writing is much more poetic, literary, metaphorical. We could pick a lot of terms and perhaps argue about which ones are most appropriate. There's a lot more going on in Camus' writing than there is in some of the other writing in terms of imagery and, in some sense, poetry. So I'm going to try to mostly cut to the heart of what it is he's getting at, or what it seems like he's getting at, because, of course, with any work that's not just immediately clear, we can have arguments about what the text really means. And one thing I'm looking for in your own writing is to have as little of that interpretive room as possible. And of course, you might say, well, isn't that sort of a weird double standard? Well, in some sense, yes. But part of what I'm really trying to encourage and train you to do in a way is to write clearly, to write in a way that can be very useful for other people. Perhaps you're going to go on and be a great literary person. Maybe you're going to be like Camus. Certainly could be. I'm not here to tell you you can't do that. But it's not what I'm training you to do. I'm trying to train you to do something else that I think has a widespread use and good function. And even if you hope to be able to write like Camus or someone like that, or be able to do different sorts of things in your writing, it's very useful to at least have the skill to be able to write in the particular mode I'm trying to encourage you to write it. Okay, so getting on to the first points here. So this issue of the meaning of life, this question of what the meaning of life is, Camus says, and it really remarks that a lot of people just avoid this question. They don't come around to it for one reason or another. But once it's raised, once we pause, once we think about this sort of issue, he says this is really the definitive awakening. This is something that is important to us. And either we return to the way we were before, we just come to ignore the question, right? Or it's something we have to really deal with. It's something that we, this is this kind of question that might come up and then we just sort of go back to the way we were and just eventually ignore it. Or it's something really important. Now, Camus himself thinks that this is one of the most important questions. Really, it's the most urgent of all. And he judges urgency in terms of consequences. So why is this the most urgent question, or at least the question of suicide? Well, of course, because if we answer the question in one way, then there are no further answers that are required, right? There's nothing else to do. So Camus sees the question of, what's the meaning of life, and should we commit suicide as really being interwoven in some sense. We're going to see that he comes to really break them apart, but when he's first exploring this, he sees them as really being wrapped together. Now, one other quick thing I want to note, and I'm going to wander off screen for a second, which is something I've tried to avoid doing, but I'm just sort of getting sick of being stuck in front of the camera. The text that the reading comes from, so here's my version of it, The Myth of Sisyphus. It's actually an entire book. So we've got it sort of pared down to about 10 pages in our reader. I put up another 3 pages or something like that for supplemental reading, because they cut out the part where he talks explicitly about the meaning of life and really suicide. And overall, I really, really like our course reader. But there are just a few decisions about what they included that I just can't wrap my head around. So anyway, the Myth of Sisyphus itself is about 125 pages long, and there's some other works in here. But it's actually a very long work. He talks about all sorts of different things. I'll use the word meanders, not in the sense of, I think, being fruitless or uninteresting, but really he goes all over the place. So this is really sort of this very trimmed down version we have here, where he's trying to talk about some of these things, and it's trying to piece together some of the things he's saying here. So in coming into this, really he's seeing that the question of suicide and the question of the meaning of life are really interwoven. If we take that question of the meaning of life really seriously, he says either we're going to wind up, it'll lead to suicide, or it leads to a kind of recovery, that we wind up being in a, if we take that question seriously, we wind up being in a different state after we have perhaps not answered it, but dealt with it in a certain sort of way. Now, if we look on the side of suicide, right, if we take this question seriously, we see it as a definitive awakening, and not that we commit suicide, but when we look at people that do commit suicide, Camus says we can diagnose that and really take something from it. Suicide really means making a judgment of some sort. Really that in some way life isn't worth living. So he notes that people die because they, both because they think life isn't worth living, and that people also die for the reasons that they think life is worth living. What does he mean by that? Well, here, think about the context, say, of World War II or, war. People who die for what they believe in, right? Say they die fighting a war or something like that. But it could be even something else, right? People can die for code, for religion, family, friends, depending on what it is. Say you've got some sort of terminal illness. You could save your life through a very expensive operation, but it would sort of eat up all of the money that your family could otherwise use for other things. So you decide that you're going to die rather than spend all the family money to keep yourself alive, right? So Camus says we can see that people die, both because they think there's no reason to live, as well as because they think there are good reasons to live, that other things are valuable, that in fact some things are more valuable than living. But committing suicide itself, as he says, is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it. Living, naturally, is never easy, he tells us. We have to make certain gestures, engage in certain habits, right? We have to eat, work, right? We go through a lot of trouble just to stay alive. Right? He says, dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. So we've got this diagnosis of suicide, and Camus thinks a little bit more broadly. What's the relationship of humans to the world around us? So he's characterized a little bit what human life is like. It's this, sort of agitation. It's this suffering. It's this habit. It's this constant effort, struggle. Right? Now, the world around us, he says, is really, in some sense, hostile. It's very different from us. As he puts it here, at the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. Now, he himself is an atheist like other existentialists. He doesn't believe in a personal God who imbues meaning or purpose or value on the universe. So when he looks at the world around him, say the Rockies or something like this, what he sees is really something that is in some sense quite different from us, because of course we think, we transcend the world in a certain way through our thought. We're not trapped by just our time and place. And in fact, even when we look at the world, we shape it after our own image in some sense. So Camus holds that all thinking is in some sense anthropomorphic. We think in human terms, we view the world through human terms. And this was something that we've seen some other thinkers mention as well, that just the way we look at the world and think about it and draw distinctions about it really imposes something on it that isn't already there. So, we talk about a particular forest existing or something like that. It's not to say that there aren't really trees there and creatures living in it and so on, but to distinguish between things, the way we draw boundaries, the way we talk about particular events or, the passage of time and so on. These are all things that we, in some sense, impose on the world. The world itself is, in some ways, alien to us, right? And hostile to us. It doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about our projects. And here I think about, particularly being in the mountains. I find the mountains really drive this home for me. Here are these rock formations and this whole area, this massive area that has just been there for, years and years and years, far, far longer than I've been around. They're going to be there far longer than I will be. And they are hostile in a sense. They're beautiful. I find them beautiful through a particular act of human perception and appreciation, perhaps in a way that other humans don't. I'm not saying I'm particularly special and bring something to them that other people don't, but I just find something very, very appealing about mountains, just in general. They really sort of do it for me, whatever that means. Other people might just not be so interested, right? It doesn't sort of get them going in the same way it does me. But I also realize that they're very hostile, right? All that rock, it's very hard. If you go, you go mountain climbing or something and you fall, the mountain doesn't care if you die on it, right? It's just completely indifferent. And even in saying that, even in characterizing it that way, we can easily slip into thinking that the mountain itself has some kind of thoughts or feelings, and it just doesn't extend them to us. But that's not even right. It's just not a thing in that sense, right? It's not a subject. It's perhaps an object of some sort. Okay, so we've got this uncaring, inhuman world that's just different from us, right? It doesn't have the sorts of plans and projects we do. It doesn't have the same sorts of values or anything like that. But our own intelligence produces the feeling of the absurd. So it's not the world that produces the absurd on its own, rather it's our collision with the world in some sense, because our intelligence, as I've already noted here, makes us transcend the world, right? And it makes us even transcend ourselves. We can see beyond our immediate purposes, what we're doing, we can think about our situation, and we think about the world around us. But our intelligence also makes us desire a kind of unity and cohesion. And here we can think back to Klemke, a kind of integration in a sense, right? We want some way of comprehending the world and we can't find it. And so Camus talks about religion in these terms, but also just talks about reasoning in general, philosophy, science. We can boil down a lot of human intellectual activity, not necessarily all of it, but a lot of human intellectual activity, particularly our attempts at understanding things, as ways of reducing complexity to principles and something that's unified. And so we can see this in religion in one sense, in trying to reduce the great complexity of the world as we find it down to something comprehensible, such as God's plan or purposes or values or intentions, right? If we can think about the entire world in terms of what one being wants, even if that being is incredibly powerful and incredibly complicated and understands and approaches things in a way that we cannot fully grasp, we can still, by grasping that that being exists, that being controls everything else, engages it, we can reduce the great complexity of the world in some sense to this one thing. Right? And as long as we can understand that, or to the extent that we can understand that one thing, we understand the entire world. Not even the entire world, the entire universe. Right? So there's a great feeling of security and power that comes with that sort of understanding. Now, if we aren't religious in that sense, or if we don't find that kind of consolation in religion, we might try to find it somewhere else. And here we can look at the history of science, history of philosophy. What are many attempts in those sort of very broad areas trying to do? Certainly not all of them are trying to do this, but many of them are trying to reduce complexity to things that are more simple. Camus talks about at one point, if we reduce everything down to some formula, some theory of everything, right, stick on a t-shirt, what sort of joy would erupt? We could explain the whole complex universe phenomena around us in very simple terms, ones that we could comprehend, some kind of calculation or something we could do. It would bring us great joy. But of course we can't. Now, there's been a very long history of success in getting better at reducing the complexity of the world into simpler terms and principles and laws and so on, and making sense of it. We can think here of things like laws of motion, right? We can look at physics or chemistry. We can look at biology, right? All these fields show us certain underlying principles and patterns and regularities, and learning about those is very powerful. And of course, mathematics as well. Philosophy is largely trying to do this sort of thing in a lot of ways, finding underlying principles and so on. But really, when it gets right down to it, what's our experience of the world? And this is really where Camus wants to start from. He wants to start from a first-person, experience of the world around him. What does he really know? And he says, well, I don't know any of these things, really. What I see is this huge, complex world where all sorts of things are happening all the time. Many things are unexpected. We can't reliably predict the future, right? We can to some extent, but there's so much we don't know. There's so much we can't predict or anticipate. We want this kind of unity, this cohesion. He doesn't get into this dimension of it, but in some sense, this power, right? This kind of security. And we don't get it. But we desire it, we long for it. It's this sort of deep-rooted need we have. That's where the feeling of the absurd really comes from. So the absurd arises from our clash with this inhuman world. So we've got this desire for unity and coherence. We have this world of plurality and change. And in that, this is where the absurd really comes from. So I've got a couple of quotations here. So I think maybe I'm a little more quotation heavy in this lecture than in some of the other ones, but I'm trying to help make sense of some of the things he's saying, because I think Camus is probably one of the most difficult people we're going to be reading here. I've got a couple trimmed down versions here, but I've got a couple longer versions I'm going to read out that include these. He says, a world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of lights and illusions, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. So what's absurdity really here? It's this feeling of being alien, of not being fully at home, of being sort of different or separate. And this is exactly what Camus thinks we feel, or at least can feel, when we contemplate our situation, our relationship with the world around us, because that world is so different from us, right? What we want, what we value, what we expect, how we think and plan and anticipate is something considerably different from the world at large, he says. So he carries on elsewhere. He says, in this unintelligible and limited universe, man's fate henceforth assumes its meaning. In his recovered and now studied lucidity, the feeling of the absurd becomes clear and definite. I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of its irrational and the wild longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on the man as on the world. So it's really this separation between ourselves and the world that produces the feeling of absurdity. And this absurdity is really, if we think about it, just something being absurd in the normal sense, out of place, uncalled for, unusual, almost worthy of laughter, perhaps just utterly ridiculous. This is really how Camus sees the human situation. Right? We've got this whole way of approaching things. We've got this whole set of desires. What we want. Right? And we just think of Tolstoy here. Right? What's Tolstoy really telling us in My Confession? Right? Minimally, what he himself longs for, what he desires, some kind of, using Craig's terminology, ultimate purpose, value, significance. Right? It all needs to matter somehow. We want to matter. We want to make sense of things. And this is exactly what Camus is saying the world just doesn't give us. Right? On its own, you just take the world as it is, strip away all of the narratives and sort of stories and ways that we approach it and try to make sense of it, right? Stories about history and progress, religious narratives, just broadly speaking, religious interpretations of things. If you just bring it down to what's really there, what we experience just in the day-to-day, what do we have? Right? Well, I'm just looking out my window right now and I see leaves on the tree and sunshine. I see birds flitting around, right? And what's it all for? Nothing that I can see, right? It's just there. And the birds are going to die, and the leaves are all going to go away in the fall, and the first blossoms of spring have already disappeared on me. Is there some purpose or reason there? Is there some way to make sense of it all? Not really. It's just this pattern that happens. It's this thing that carries on, right? And I enjoy it. But what does that mean, right? I'm a planning, thinking, evaluating sort of being. And the world just doesn't seem to be like me. So isn't it odd that I'm sort of stuck here in the world, right? I want something out of it. I want it to sort of, like Tolstoy, speak to meaning and significance and purpose. But it just doesn't seem to. And this is really where the absurd comes from. Camus notes as well in the piece, if he were a different sort of creature, the absurd just wouldn't rise. If he says, if I were a tree or a cat, I would just be part of the world and there'd be no absurdity. It's really from the human ability to transcend our situation, our condition, through our intelligence, through our thinking. That's what gives rise to the absurd. So the birds I was just talking about that sort of flitter around and they reproduce and they feed and stay alive and they might migrate and do all these other things. Their existence isn't absurd in the way mine is, Camus would say, precisely because they themselves can't transcend their situation. A bird can't sort of step back and say, why bother? Why should I flit around getting all this seed and building a nest and reproducing and migrating and all this? What's it for? Does it really matter? Right? In a million years, is it going to matter if I really did all this rather than just killed myself or let a cat eat me or something? They can't do that. And it's precisely because they can't do it that their situation isn't absurd, that the feeling of the absurd doesn't arise for them. So now that he's told us about what the absurd is and how it arises, really the root cause of it, he explores the relationship of suicide to the absurd. He wonders if suicide is really the solution to it, the answer to it, right? Is that the correct response to our absurd situation? So this comes back to what you're saying at the start. It seems like, right, that if we judge that life is meaningless, that it's absurd, and these, in some sense, really come together. So our situation is absurd precisely because we seek meaning and can't find it. Right? It's not there. It's not given to us. We want it, but we just can't have it. Which itself, just as a little side note, seems to imply that meaning has to come from the world somehow. This seems to be what Camus is assuming, or what's feeding into his take here on the meaning of life, that somehow we have to have the world give us meaning or justify our existence or somehow speak to our desires and our thinking. Right? So it seems like judging that life is meaningless means that we should kill ourselves. Camus says the principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action. So he calls this the Nietzschean criterion of belief in some places, and he talks just a little bit about Schopenhauer, and says, Schopenhauer's kind of funny because he sort of praises suicide in the end of existence while dining at a well-set table and leading what seems to be an okay sort of life. But of course, Schopenhauer doesn't seem to really believe giving up on life is the right answer because he himself doesn't do it. And so when Camus is talking about this Nietzschean criterion, really he's saying, so Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century German philosopher, what Camus is taking out of Nietzsche's works, at least this one point he's taking, is that what somebody really believes is dictated by what they do. Right? What we say, what we think is, in some sense, a bit of a surface phenomenon that is, it's highly variable. We can say and think and feel all sorts of different things, but what we really do, what we feel on a deep level, that's what we really believe. In fact, Camus, as he's talking through this piece, he also notes that the body itself, our body has this kind of head start on our thinking. We learn to live through our body before we learn to really reason at all. And the body shrinks from annihilation, as he puts it. There's something instinctive that makes us recoil from mortal danger. And so the act of suicide is highly unnatural in some sense, precisely because we have to overcome that instinctive reaction and pulling back. Right? If you get to the edge of a cliff, you'll probably have sort of an instinctive reaction to pull back and to get away from it. So it's to actually push oneself to jump over the cliff or whatever it might be, really requires a sort of conscious, dedicated act. Now, Camus resists any answer that goes beyond what he knows. He doesn't take any leaps of faith. Like I was saying, he really wants to stick with what seems perhaps not obvious, but what reveals itself to him right through his experience. So in the world as he experiences it directly, and through things that he can sort of clearly understand and think about. So he refuses to take any sort of leap of faith, much like Klemke. He wants to stick with what seems sensible to him. So he puts it this way. He says, I can understand only in human terms. What I touch, what resists me, that is what I understand. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle, I also know that I cannot reconcile them. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, and which means nothing within the limits of my condition? Right? So here again, Camus is saying, what do I know? I know the absurd, right? That's really what I have. I have these two certainties, this appetite for the absolute and for unity. Right? That's one thing that he has. He knows he wants that. And on the other hand, there's this impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle. Right? He wants that unity, that in some sense simplicity, that integrity, and he can't have it. Right? He knows of no way of getting it. So if we aren't willing to take a leap of faith, and so this leap of faith, really a phrase coined by Kierkegaard, 19th century Danish sort of proto-existentialist religious thinker that we've seen come up in a number of people. That leap of faith, what is it really? Just this phrase, leap of faith, coming to believe something without having sufficient reason to believe it, believing something without the evidence. And that's really a kind of leap. We go from not believing in the thing to believing in it, yet we can't point to any particular reason why we do it. So Camus says, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm like Klemke. He refuses to engage in this sort of leap or to accept something that he doesn't fully understand or can't make full sense of. So just going back to what I was saying before, one way to try to reduce the world to something comprehensible, something familiar, something that we can be comfortable with, is precisely by taking that leap of faith and believing in a being, right, say God or some kind of rational principle or something, believing that there is something that does comprehend it all, does see the purpose of it all, does see the value of it all, right, perhaps even imposes those things. Now, while we can't, or perhaps don't fully understand that being or what that value is or the purpose is, that leap of faith is precisely taking that leap in believing that there's something that sort of meets that need of ours. Right? It's a way of satisfying ourselves, Camus thinks. And that's precisely what he refuses to do. He says, I'm not going to do it to make myself feel better. I'm only going to do it if I understand it, if I can see the reasons for it. Right? So faith is out. So instead, and here again, Klemke is really borrowing on this phrase of Camus, and Klemke is sort of putting things in a different way. Perhaps I should have talked about Klemke after Camus, but I think the arrangement makes sense this way. Right? If you have other thoughts, or if you agree, feel free to let me know. So what's left if we're not going to take a leap of faith? If we're not going to lie to ourselves, right? That might be synonymous with taking the leap of faith. It might not. What's left? Well, to find out if it's possible to live without appeal. Right? To see if there's a way to continue existing in our absurd condition without appealing to some other thing to fix it for us. Right? Appealing to God, or appealing to some sort of, the future, a caring universe, the infinite, right? Whatever it might be. Is there a way to go on living just with what we know in this very sort of personal and immediate sense, the one Camus wants to stay in, right? Not getting out into any sort of high-level theorizing or anything like that, but just sort of sticking with what it is to live as a human, right, without all of these extras. And so this is where we come to some of the material in that few extra pages of supplemental reading I stuck up on Moodle. It comes from my edition of the text, which is actually the same edition of the text that is being used in our reader. It's the same translation and everything. It's just that they sort of inexplicably cut off at one point when they said living without appeal, sort of at the end of that quotation on the previous slide. And then they sort of leap ahead to a bit later in the text, but right after that spot, Camus says something really important. So rather than suicide, Camus thinks that revolt is really the appropriate response to a situation, and that in fact, revolt gives life its value. Suicide settles the absurd. Now, I've got this note in here, physical and mental. Right? What does that mean? Well, of course, physical suicide, that makes perfect sense. We know what that means. Right? There's no mystery. Mental suicide. What is mental suicide? For Camus, this is precisely the leap of faith. Right? Whether it be the leap of faith in believing in God, or the leap of faith believing in the future. Right? He talks about believing in our someday, our retirement. Right? So you say you live through your life and you sort of grind your life out. You spend years and years working at things you don't find very interesting or rewarding, right? But everybody has to work, right? And you spend all this time, say, raising family or doing whatever, but putting off what you really want to do on the sort of illusion or the hope that someday, right? Well, when I retire, I can finally travel the world or do what I really want to do, right? But that itself is also a kind of leap, Camus says. Why? Precisely because we don't control our own existence. We don't get to decide how long we live, right? So banking on someday, right? Oh, eventually I'll get to do the things I want. Really, that's itself a kind of faith or a kind of hope, which Camus doesn't want to have, right? He really wants to boil us down to, how can I live day to day through my life in this absurd condition? So mental suicide is really stepping outside of what makes sense, right? Going beyond our reasoning and what's clear to us, and believing in something that is really outside of our control or something that doesn't fully make sense. So what does revolt entail, right? Or sort of what is it like? Well, Camus says that, he says this about revolt. He says, it is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. That revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. To a man devoid of blinders, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence it grips with a reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequaled. So what is this revolt? Right? Well, as he says, it's not an aspiration or a hope. It's not hoping that eventually things are going to be better. Rather, it's really taking the situation for what it is and revolting against what we're really revolting against, in some sense, the world. It's revolting against the absurd. It's embracing, in some sense, our existence. So, one thought that comes to my mind when I read about what Camus is saying here about revolt, think about, in a war, whatever kind of war you want, think about a battle that really can't be won, right? So say, it's medieval times and we're trapped in a castle and there's, a few hundred defenders, but there's just sort of thousands, there's legions of the enemy. There's no way we can win. There are no reinforcements coming. The enemy's about to siege the castle. What do you do? Right. Well, there's a few options. One, we can just kill ourselves. Let's just cut to the chase and get it over with. We know we're going to lose. Right? There's just no hope here. We know we're dead. So why don't we do it in the quickest, most pleasant way possible? We could also perhaps, surrender. But that seems to be banking on a kind of hope, right? Well, maybe they'll treat us well, maybe they won't kill us, right? But let's just assume we know for a fact that they're going to kill us, right? Perhaps torture us, whatever. So what other option is there? Well, the revolt, the fight, right? To carry it on, to accept the situation and to engage with it fully, right? To fight to the bitter end, even though there's no hope that we're going to win. There's no hope that things are going to get better. It's to do it anyway. Right? That, to me, at least that's the best way I can really understand what Camus is talking about. He's talking about revolt here. It's really defying death. It's putting it off. It's refusing to accept it, even though that's our inevitable outcome. Right? We know that's how it ends. Right? And we know that the world around us, the universe around us, isn't going to care when we're gone. Right? Not going to be interested. It doesn't share our values and our projects and our longing for significance, right? So we know, thinking again back to Tolstoy, it ends with stench and worms. It's all dust and death. Revolt is precisely recognizing that fact and refusing to accept it. Right? So revolt is actually the opposite of suicide. Suicide is accepting that and really sort of just taking this leap and just being unable to live with the absurd. Right? Suicide is a way of giving up, right? Judging it's just not worth persisting in this absurd existence we find ourselves just sort of thrust into without choice. Revolt is the opposite. So really, revolt is what gives life its value, as he puts it. But that doesn't mean revolt gives life its meaning. In fact, given what Camus says, and there's a real question about if he's fully consistent, he himself maybe didn't care so much if he was fully consistent. Earlier, he sort of talks about meaning, and he seems to talk about it in a positive sense. But then here, when he's talking about revolt, he really talks about life not having meaning. So as he puts it, right, we get, if we are absurd persons, that is, if we revolt, we just accept our situation and go on living. Perhaps not even in spite of it, but embrace the fact that our existence is absurd, that there's no cosmic purpose or significance or value, that everything's on the table, right? In some sense, you can't get it wrong because there's no getting it right. Camus says, if we lead our life that way, right? If we accept it and we realize that there's just really, no cosmic plan or value or anything like that, there's no sort of cosmic standard by which we can judge ourselves. We can actually be freed, right? Life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning, right? Why? Because living an experience, particular fate, is accepting it fully. It's realizing that the situation we find ourselves in, who we are, is really all we are. That there's not some more or better or someday that we're missing, right? That we're not living up to or accepting or doing correctly. So just from what he says here, right, on the very top, top line I've got here, revolt gives life its value. So he thinks life can be valuable. But then down at the bottom here in the quote, life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Right? Camus says this. He says, the absurd enlightens me. There is no future. Henceforth, this is the reason for my inner freedom. But what does life mean in such a universe? Nothing else for the moment but indifference to the future and a desire to use up everything that is given. Belief in the meaning of life always implies a scale of values, a choice, our preferences. Belief in the absurd, according to our definitions, teaches the contrary. An absurd life is one that can be lived in the moment. This is not to say that really, and this might seem to contradict what Camus is saying right there, so perhaps I'm wrong. That's always an open possibility when we're doing philosophy. It doesn't mean having absolutely no plans or projects whatsoever. In fact, Camus' own life really shows us that that's not what he's saying, because he himself continued to write books and pieces and engage in projects and activities. So it's not like he's saying, you can't do anything that does anything outside of just the present moment. But rather, really what he's getting at is that it's the present moment that matters. It's not the eventual accomplishment, right, in terms of his writing and literary career. It's not that he was sort of banking on eventually being a famous author or something, and that's why he did it, right? He didn't actually enjoy what he was doing, didn't put himself into it in what he was actually doing at the time, but rather it's all sort of the other way around. It's about living in the moment, doing what you want, doing the thing you find to be valuable, and letting the future sort of come as it may, right? Letting the chips fall as they do, right? Just sort of seeing what happens, just embracing the existence we have, not looking for something else. So just thinking a little bit more, what's Camus really getting at, or what does he seem to be really getting at? Well, it seems like for Camus that life can have value. Right? And I was talking a little bit about this when I was talking about Klemke yesterday. Life can have value through revolt, through a kind of embracing it. But it can't have meaning. And so what does that amount to for Camus? Well, what it seems to be is that meaning is tied to purpose, and perhaps ultimate purpose of some sort. Purpose or union somehow connected to or with the world around us, right? Somehow finding that unity, that cohesion, that integration. Meaning seems to be tied up with that to some extent, right? And even just in the way I've been formulating this, right, I think it's fairly clear that I'm having trouble clearly articulating exactly what I take that to be. But I think Camus is really thinking of meaning along these lines, some sort of union or integration with the world, some sort of ultimate plan or purpose or achievement. And that's what we don't have, right? And that's what is really out of our reach, even if we want it, which he thinks we do want it. That's really why the absurd arises in the first place. What we can do, though, is revolt. We can embrace our life, we can live it, we can enjoy it, right? Even though we know it doesn't lead to anything else, even though there is no purpose, even though there is no union or integration with the world, because the world is just a very different thing than we are. But we can go on living nevertheless. So we can have a valuable life, just not a meaningful life. And in fact, life is more valuable the less meaning we try to find in it, precisely because trying to find meaning is a way of devaluing certain things. If we think there is some particular meaning to life or some particular purpose, then we start judging everything else based on how well it serves that purpose. So say, there really is a meaning or purpose in life. Perhaps it's, I don't know, serving God's plan, or say for me, being a great philosopher. Say that's the meaning of my life. Well, so what does that imply then, right? If my purpose is to be a great philosopher or serve a role in God's plan, if I'm doing anything other than that, am I doing something wrong or not valuable, something that's not contributing to my meaning or purpose? If I enjoy time with family and friends, am I spending less time doing philosophy, therefore I'm wasting my time, so I'm not leading my life correct? Right? This is exactly what Camus is getting at, right? Stop that. Stop thinking that way, right? It's not about where you're going to get to and what are you going to accomplish and did you do it right? Because the world's just not like that, right? That's how we think, but that's not how the world thinks. That's not how an entire life can be judged, right? That's not how we should judge our life. And this is where Camus comes around to the Myth of Sisyphus, really the name of this whole book, the whole long piece. So Sisyphus is the absurd hero in Camus' eyes. Now, Sisyphus himself is this character in Greek Roman mythology. And Camus gives a few different versions of the Sisyphean legend. One thing to note about Greco-Roman mythology is that it, largely speaking, especially in its original Greek form, was not a religion of the book. It's not like Judaism or Christianity or Islam that has a particular holy text that, in some canonical form that provides sort of a set of written doctrines or stories or narratives to be interpreted and shared. It doesn't have a church hierarchy in the same kind of way. It doesn't have an institutionalized religion. Instead, it was sometimes very much a grassroots religion. Disorganized seems like a pejorative term, so maybe I'll resist saying that. But there are different versions of different myths. So there is a common, sort of set of gods and characteristics of those gods, but there could be different versions of stories and legends and myths and so on. And so this is what Camus is giving, so different versions of Sisyphus. Ultimately, Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to roll a rock in the underworld for defying them. In at least one version of the myth, after death, Sisyphus gets special permission to return to Earth for a short time, but, as Camus tells us, when he had seen again the face of this world, enjoyed water and sun, warm stones in the sea, he no longer wanted to go back to the infernal darkness. Recalls, signs of anger, warnings were of no avail. Many years more he lived facing the curve of the gulf, the sparkling sea, and the smiles of the earth. Right? So what does Sisyphus represent here? Right? No matter what the gods wanted from him, what did Sisyphus really embrace? Right? Earthly existence. Right? That's what he wanted. That's what he privileged. Right? He found nothing higher or better than just being here. Right, and enjoying it for what it is, right, despite any indication of the contrary. For defying the gods, Sisyphus is condemned to roll his rock up a mountain, sort of in the underworld for eternity. the rock, you know, he rolls the rock up. It's this big boulder. It's not this like little thing that he just carries up. Rather, it's this huge boulder, and he has to sort of put all his effort into getting it up the hill. And when he gets it to the top, it just rolls back down again. And then he has to push it back up, only to have it roll back down again. And this is Sisyphus's fate, to roll the rock up the hill and have it roll back down for eternity. And it is just the, you know, perfect image of fruitless labor. Right, he puts all of this energy, all of this effort into getting the stone up the hill. For what purpose? Well, none. Right, there isn't one. As soon as it's up, it goes back down again. And we can think about Sisyphean tasks as really any task that you know, you sort of do it, and you achieve it, and as soon as it's done, it's back down again. In fact, at home, my wife and I have to joke about our Sisyphean labors. Right, things like sweeping the floors or vacuuming, doing the dishes, laundry, right? All of these tasks, as soon as they're done, they just start piling up again, right? And it's just this cycle, right? It's this constant cycle. In fact, before I was sort of really a philosopher, if that's a way we want to think, in high school, I worked at a convenience store, and I would, you know, sweep the floors of the store, and I'd even sweep the sidewalks outside of the store just to keep it all clean. But of course, as soon as you're done, right, it just starts getting dirty again. So even before I really started doing philosophy, I had this sense of Sisyphean labor. I would sort of sweep things, and I'd look at it and see people tracking dirt again, and see dirt sort of blow back in. Sort of, why did I even bother? Right, we're going to be right back where we started in no time. What is the point of this? Right? Well, there's at least two ways to look at it. One, there's no point, because there's no ultimate point. There's no ever sort of getting clean or getting it done. But on the other hand, right, perhaps there is a point, at least in the short term, right? When I swept those sidewalks or those floors, when I do the dishes or whatever it is, at least for that time, it's complete, right? Even if as time goes on, that work will be undone, entropy increases, right? We always have more things to do. If we want order, we always have to fight against the growing chaos. So there's a question of, do we think it's worth doing if it's only temporary? And perhaps that's not something we can answer in a cognitive way, right? Perhaps there's no right answer. Values aren't really out there in the universe. This seems to be the view that Camus and people like Klemke are looking at. Edwards, not quite as clear. But if there's no fact of the matter, right, whether or not it's worth doing, then it seems like what we open up is really a zone for our preference, for how we feel about it. And this is certainly something that Klemke and Edwards were sort of interested in. Right? Perhaps there just is no truth about the matter. Is it worth doing that thing if it's just going to be undone, you know, a short time later? Maybe one person says yes and another person says no. We could look at that as a disagreement where somebody's going to be right and somebody's going to be wrong. We can also look at it as merely a difference of opinion, right? Or a difference of feeling. It's like if two people have different favorite flavors of ice cream, we often don't think one of those people is right, right, and everyone's wrong. Rather, we just sort of look at it and say, okay, well, you feel differently than I do. You have different tastes than I do. Right? I like this, you like that, and well, that's all there is to it. So, with Sisyphus being the absurd hero, Camus tells us this. He says, he is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. Now, his fate seems tragic, right? That he has to roll this boulder up the hill and have it fall back down for eternity. You know, fruitless labor that takes all of his energy and all of his effort. If Sisyphus weren't conscious of it, right? If they just sort of like his body did it, but he had no conscious awareness of what he was doing, they just turned him into a kind of automaton. Camus says, you know, there really wouldn't be any tragedy here. We wouldn't think there's anything wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a machine constantly doing some repetitive task forever, right? Because it's not conscious of what it's doing. Even a human doing a repetitive task, right? Dishes, sweeping, right? Whatever. You know, these things we do. Right? Look, showering, shaving, right? Well, at least for me, right? At least partially. These things that we do, right? We do them over and over and over again. Even there, Camus says, there's nothing really tragic or upsetting about it if we aren't aware of it, right? It's only once we become aware of these patterns and these habits and the fact that we're doing these things over and over, right? It's once we become aware and we don't see the point, that's where the problem comes in. Sisyphus's punishment seems designed precisely to put him in that situation. He has to do this repetitive thing that has no further point, and he's so fully aware of it. That's what makes it a punishment in the first place. But Camus says, even though Sisyphus is in some sense tragic, he's conscious of his fate, he can still overcome it. It's his own lucidity that can make him victorious over his fate. As Camus tells us, there's no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. And he tells us that happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. It happens as well that the feeling of the absurd springs from happiness. So he thinks these two things come together, right? That in fact, recognizing our absurd situation, really revolting against this world that otherwise could be crushing us, and accepting our situation really can allow us to be happy. Even Sisyphus can be happy, right? If he, in some sense, accepts his situation and puts himself into it, rather than thinking there's something he's missing out on, he's missing some purpose or meaning, right? Instead, if he just embraces the situation he finds himself in, right, and scorns the gods, really rejects the God's own attitude that his situation is a punishment, he can overcome it. And so Camus closes with this. He says, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. The universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And with that, we come to the end of our examination of Camus, the Myth of Sisyphus. Takeaways, brief takeaways here. As I was saying earlier, Camus talks quite a bit about revolt. He talks about value, he talks about meaning. It seems like for Camus, meaning involves some sort of purpose or significance, some kind of union or integration with the world. Right? That he thinks we really can't get. So we can't have that meaning. We find ourselves in an absurd situation. We find ourselves sort of thrust into this world, wanting, craving some kind of purpose, significance, value, importance. Right? But we don't find it. Right? We find ourselves one very small part of a very large world, and a world that transcends us in a way. And of course, there's the whole human world of activity and projects and economics and whatever. But then there's the rest of the world, right? There's nature, right? There are the mountains, there are the trees, there's the birds. While that doesn't seem important in one way, it's this thing that constantly confronts us, right? As something alien, different, right? Especially if we look out and we start thinking even broader, we think in terms of the universe, and we start doing astronomy and cosmology and think about where did everything come from, where's it going, how big is it? We go back to some of that stuff at the start of the course. I was talking about how many stars there are, how many probable planets. We're up to over 4,000 confirmed planets outside of our solar system. What's the point of it all, right? Where's it headed? What's its value? None is apparent, right? Nothing leaps out at us. Of course, we can take that leap of faith. We can put our stock into something else. Right? We can put it in God or some sort of overall value that's just part of the universe, or even something within life, or we can see some sort of project about humanity or family or whatever it might be. Camus says, instead of that, instead of trying to take that leap, instead of trying to commit suicide physically and just sort of end our absurd situation, or mentally, which is a different way of trying to end our absurd situation, we can stay in that absurdity, right? We can recognize our situation for what it is, but then really revolt against what could be a crushing fate, and accept that situation. Much like Sisyphus, we can face our absurd situations and our unending and ultimately pointless labors, and we can accept them as ours and ultimately be happy. with who we are and where we are and the time that we have. That's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow talking about Nagel in a second piece of his that we're looking at, in which he will respond to Camus' take on the absurd. Until then, bye for now.